AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota. Brett Johnson with you here on a Tuesday afternoon. Well, right now we're joined by the editor-in-chief of the Minnesota Reformer. That's Patrick Coolican for his usual Tuesday weekly visit, as we have lots of news to cover in the world of politics today, being that, well, obviously we have a change of the top of the ticket for the Democratic Party, as we'll be talking about that and how many of the DFLers and power brokers within the Democratic Party here in Minnesota were able to coalesce around Kamala Harris. Plus, we'll be talking about Patrick's column on Tom Emmer and taking a look back at his previous stances on immigration and how they have evolved over the years to largely, well, fit the mold of Donald Trump and his ilk. Plus, we'll be talking about a Republican candidate for Minnesota House who's part of Action for Liberty that has run into a number of tax troubles himself. So, Patrick, thanks so much for coming back on the show today.
Always a pleasure.
Absolutely. So let's start off talking, of course, about the big news, and that obviously is Kamala Harris. Now, the presumptive Democratic nominee for president. There still technically is going to be a primary race at the convention, but it looks like she is very much the front runner, and many DFLers and big-name Democrats here in Minnesota have began to coalesce around Kamala Harris and endorse her, including Amy Klobuchar, Tina Smith, Ilhan Omar, Dean Phillips, and others. But in what you wrote over the weekend, Patrick, you talked about how there was one key name that joined that list in that endorsement of Kamala Harris, which was very key, and that is the chair of the DFL, Ken Martin. Talk about the significance of his endorsement behind Kamala Harris and why this is such a big deal.
Yeah, people may not know the name, but he's the DFL chair in his fifth term. He's also well-known nationally because the Minnesota Democratic Party is considered one of the best-run and most effective. And he's just been an effective and shrewd operator. And so when he came out with kind of a full-throated endorsement at a press conference on Sunday afternoon, I took that to be pretty significant insofar as it signaled to me that the party insiders were really quickly coalescing around Harris, and there wasn't going to be much room for an alternative. Because if you remember the few weeks leading up to the resignation, when President Biden announced he was not going to run for re-election, I think there was quite a bit of speculation about some sort of open primary and some kind of, or open convention, I should say, and a mini primary, and various names were being bandied about. And I think leadership of the Democratic Party, such as it is, because it is a lot more chaotic than people think, and there are not a half dozen people making decisions in Washington or anything like that. But I do feel like there was a consensus that there needed to be fast movement, and I know Ken Martin, having known him and covered him for a decade, there are a few things that you hear from him repeatedly, and one of them is that the one thing you can't get more of in a campaign is time, and the risk of some sort of intra-party battle for the nomination was going to quickly reduce the amount of simple days that they have between now and Election Day to coalesce and get ready and go. So I knew that he would want to press that point, and sure enough, he did. He also doesn't like contentious, expensive primaries, and so he was really laying down a marker for not just Minnesota delegates, but I think for state party chairs around the country. He's the head of the Democratic State Party Chair Association, and certainly somebody who's got the ear of the White House and the DNC. So I thought that was significant, and sure enough, the things moved really quickly, and she had the nomination wrapped up. I think really you would say by Monday noon, it seemed like it was a done deal, and now it is.
And of course, he is key in lining up not just obviously our elected officials here in Minnesota that are Democrats, but even super delegates, a term you might remember back from a few conventions ago, and we do have some Minnesota super delegates, so obviously he was influential in getting them on board with Kamala Harris. But what about the other delegates in Minnesota? How have they been lining up? Have they pretty much also been going on board for Kamala Harris as well?
Yeah, Minnesota Public Radio, they tried to reach all of them on Sunday. And of those that they reached, I think it was something like 41 that were Harris, and there was a little more than a dozen, maybe a baker's dozen of folks who said they declined to say, or they wanted an open convention or had some other answer. And there's only, I think, 90 or so delegates. So of the 55 or so that they reached, 40 were with Harris. And I'm sure if you ask those remaining 15, a lot of them would be with Harris by now. So I think those delegates are firmly in hand, and we know she has enough delegates to get the nomination, and there's been no serious alternative put forward. So I think I also just feel like the party, after such a divisive few weeks, when there were people saying that President Biden has to withdraw from re-election, and then those who were backing him, and it was getting pretty ugly. I think everybody on the Democratic folks, rank and file Democrats, were really eager to see some unity and some energy around a new candidate right away. And I think that's what we're seeing.
So obviously it looks like, the presidency is largely sealed up in terms of a Democratic nomination with Kamala Harris. But of course, the other office that is not sewn up yet is the vice presidential nominee. And I'm curious what your thoughts are, and even what we've heard from some of the elected DFLers here in Minnesota, what their thoughts are on Tim Walz possibly filling that void, since he does have many assets that, at least on paper, could be beneficial to anyone who would be running for president on behalf of the Democratic Party, being that he, of course, is from the Midwest and has been a two-term governor of the state. What are you hearing about speculation around Tim Walz possibly being a VP candidate?
Yeah, on paper, there's a lot there to like. There's the National Guard. I think he's the highest-ranking enlisted man in the U.S. Congress and in American history. Teacher, football coach. He helped Democrats get a trifecta here. They passed a bunch of progressive policies. Minnesota's a top state when you consider things like life expectancy and wages and healthcare outcomes and education outcomes. So there's a story to tell about Minnesota. He's a good communicator. I mean, he can be a little uneven on that front in terms of clarity, but generally speaking, he really does well, especially with a live audience. For the last 18 months or so, he's been doing a lot of national media, so he's really well experienced in that. The problem for Walz, and I think there's also a belief that he could appeal. He's from Nebraska, he's in Minnesota, that he really would appeal to white working class voters that you need in the blue wall states of Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and including the second congressional district of Nebraska, where you can pick up a electoral college vote. The problem I see is that Minnesota is not really a battleground state. If Minnesota is a battleground state, then the election's over and Donald Trump's going to be president, to be honest. And so they're probably looking at somebody from a state that's much more in play. That's why I think Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania or Mark Kelly, U.S. Senator and former astronaut from Arizona, are probably higher on the list. But you never know. I think the vice president is often just somebody who meshes well with the presidential nominee. The two people that have chemistry And so maybe that'll be the case with Harris. I mean, it does seem as if he's on a longer list of folks being vetted, and it would certainly be exciting for us here. But I think at this point, despite all his attributes, he's probably second tier.
Yeah, at least from what I've seen on many of these lists that speculate potential VP nominees, yeah, he's usually not at the top, but he is on the list at least somewhere. So maybe he'll be a dark horse, but yeah, to me it looks like there are probably a few more people that would be ahead of him on that list. We're speaking with Patrick Coolican, who is the editor-in-chief of the Minnesota Reformer. Make sure you go to minnesotareformer.com. I want to move on and talk about a column you wrote this week titled, "What Will Happen to Emmer's Beloved Constitution When They Carry Out Mass Deportations?" Because you talk about a podcast that I heard back in 2015 myself. That was This American Life, where Tom Emmer made an appearance on the show back in 2015. And it was talking about what was happening in St. Cloud and the turn against many Somali immigrants in that area. And basically what happened was that there was a public meeting that Emmer attended where many white people in the audience were calling for a moratorium on new Somali residents in St. Cloud. But what's interesting about this back in 2015 is that Emmer largely pushed back against many of these efforts from his constituents, including those that he knew pretty well, against this idea of trying to put a moratorium on Somali immigrants in the St. Cloud area. So can you provide a brief overview of Tom Emmer's at least history and his initial stances on immigration, particularly what we've been seeing in St. Cloud with, again, this interesting appearance he made back in 2015, trying to push back against this idea of putting a moratorium on Somali immigrants. And then now, lo and behold, we see him at the Republican National Convention and embracing this idea of mass deportations. Those will be those signs that we saw all over the RNC. So let's talk about his evolution and his views on immigration over the years.
Yeah, I had this kind of interesting view of Emmer because I arrived in 2014, and so that is, after he had run this pretty brutal race for governor, came pretty close to winning, but didn't. I think he was known as kind of a blustery, bomb-throwing Republican. And then he came back in 2014 to run for the House seat in the 6th District. And when I talked to him, because I was covering that race, such as it was, because it's a very solidly Republican district, I did talk to him, and he came across pretty low-key, and he made... at least what he was trying to convey was that he was going to be much more pragmatic, and he was going to mostly look after the interests of the district rather than partisan bomb throwing. And so that was my first impression of him in person when I met with him one-on-one. And then I heard that a couple years later he got elected, and sure enough, he kept his head down, and he seemed to be working on a niche, which was got himself on financial services, an incredibly powerful committee in Washington, largely because of because you're so close to Wall Street money. And he started working his way up, and then I heard This American Life episode, and it was pretty impressive because politicians, they tend to fall into the trap of telling the audience what they want to hear. And all of these folks in St. Cloud, this is almost a decade ago now, so people may not remember, but there was quite an increase in Somali Americans and Somali refugees living in St. Cloud, and it was pretty quick. And I think it created quite a bit of unease amongst some of the white people in St. Cloud, and there was this actual movement of saying, like, we shouldn't allow any more Somali Americans to live here. And there was Emmer really pushing back and saying, I don't know what you're talking about here. That's not the United States of America. We can't just stop people from moving here. And the United States Constitution allows people to live wherever they want. And clearly it upset some of his constituents, but he held firm. And I was pretty fascinated by it. And And then again in 2020, after the election, and there was all this nonsense about it, there being fraud and what we came to call the big lie. And Emmer, unlike so many of his colleagues in the Republican House caucus, he voted to certify the results. And he said the U.S. Constitution does not give me the authority to approve this other slate of electors. The legislatures of these states have sent their electors, and that's what I'm obligated to do by the Constitution. So, you hear him talk about the sanctity of the U.S. Constitution, and then there he is at the Republican convention last week. It's hard to believe it was only last week.
Yeah.
But the thing that I found so just astounding and appalling about that convention is just how open they were about this favoring mass deportation, including they had signs made up that said that, and they just an absolute monstrosity if you think about the what it would mean to try to deport 10 or 15 or 18 million, whatever your estimate of undocumented people here, what that would really entail, and the kind of extra legal and unconstitutional actions it would require, and the sheer depravity and cruelty of it. And so, it's not a perfect parallel because we're talking about undocumented immigrants, whereas in 2015, 2016, he was talking about people who were Somali Americans who were in the country legally. But I still found it to be a rather depressing evolution for him to go from defending the rights of Somali Americans to live in a place like St. Cloud, because that's what the Constitution allows, and also that's just America. I mean, come on. to go all the way from there to 10 years later, got a speaking slot. He's majority whip, and he's standing there. And while they're talking about mass deports, we're talking about the movement of millions of people and everything that would require. So to me, it's a sad story, frankly.
I would agree. I mean, I wasn't necessarily expecting him to go on the stage and try to push back against what he was seeing at the RNC, similar to what he did at that town hall meeting back in 2015 in St. Cloud. But I think it's just more proof that, well, to use the words of Donald Trump, he is going to bend the knee when he has to, whether it is his stance on immigration or, as you were talking about, when he was certifying the 2020 election. It seems like he's someone that is largely willing to do just about anything to make sure he keeps his political power within the Republican Party. And at least in a very craven sense, you can't really blame him, since anyone who tries to challenge the current Republican Party that is a Republican, well, largely gets excommunicated from the party. So I think he's kind of seeing the writing on the wall and seeing what he has to do, which, as we were saying, is a very depressing thought with where the Republican Party is right now.
Yeah, I mean, let's go back 6 months ago or 9 months ago, when the House Republicans created all that chaos when they deposed the Speaker of the House, and there was for a minute there when Tom Emmer, the majority whip, had made a run for House Speaker, and Trump and his folks, because he had voted for certifying the election results, they called him a globalist rhino, and they whipped votes against him, and clearly the whole thing was never going to happen, and it was a short-lived attempt to become speaker. And then Trump did that thing they all have to do, and it was as Trump himself is allegedly said, according to an unnamed source in the New York Times, they all bend the knee, and it's a shocking thing to have happened in the Republican Party. I think if there's one clear contrast with the Democrats, when Joe Biden had a bad debate performance, and it was really unclear that he was going to be able to have the energy to run an effective presidential campaign, a lot of Democrats started saying he needs to step aside. And were they thrown out of the party? Were they forced to bend the knee? Absolutely not. They were not. And in fact, they wound up prevailing. I think that's what we expect in American politics, but that is just not the case in the Republican Party.
You can read more about Patrick's column titled, What Will Happen to Emmer's Beloved Constitution When They Carry Out Their Mass Deportation? Again, over at MinnesotaReformer.com. I know we're running a little long, so I want to briefly touch on one more story that you guys are working on, and this is something Michelle Griffith wrote about, titled, Republican Minnesota House Candidate Has a History of Tax Delinquency and Filed for Bankruptcy. And who we're talking about is Isanti Mayor Jimmy Gordon, who is running in a GOP primary against a six-term incumbent, that's Representative Brian Johnson, who is from the Cambridge area. But Gordon, interestingly, has had some tax troubles over the years, including a nearly $39,000 federal tax lien. So what I find interesting about this is that whenever we see this from Republicans, they typically are running to have lower taxes, which obviously seems a little convenient. But tell us a little bit about some of the tax issues he's been running into and a little bit more about this race for this GOP primary, because as I understand it, Jimmy Gordon is part of this Action for Liberty group, which is a very far-right group that has been gaining prominence within the Minnesota Republican movement.
Right. It's pretty wild here that Brian Johnson is, I think, in his sixth term. He's chaired a committee when the Republicans were in the majority. He's now facing this challenger, I guess because he's not far right enough. And so this local, the mayor of Isanti is challenging him. He actually won the Republican endorsement. Johnson's is going to the primary, so they'll have a primary in August. But certainly the endorsement on the Republican side still means a lot. So the Isanti mayor probably has a good shot at this. He's got a long history of pretty serious financial problems. There's a bankruptcy, and then he had more recently in 2019, he had a $38,000 tax lien on his house by the IRS. That lien has not been released according to the county records. We went up to the reporter went up to the county offices up there to check. He says he's paid that bill that when he sold his last house. More recently, he sold it. He paid off the IRS, and he showed us a picture of a computer screen showing zero balance of the IRS. In any case, in addition to that one, he had a local tax, a state tax issue. He had a couple state tax issues over in South Dakota. I kind of feel like if you have this kind of history, I think the voters ought to know about it, and that's why we went ahead with the story. Interestingly, it's the second bankruptcy we've reported on in House races. So I'm glad that we are around to do some of this vetting, because there's some basics that I think we can expect out of people who are in the legislature, and being up to date on your taxes seems like one of them.
Yeah, and as we said, this isn't the first time he's run into tax trouble, so I'm glad you guys are covering that and bringing, some of these to light to make sure that we have the full picture of who some of these candidates are that are running for a state legislature. And you can read more about Michelle's reporting about this guy, Jimmy Gordon, who is running in a GOP primary against current Representative Brian Johnson. Find that over at MinnesotaReformer.com. We have been speaking with Patrick Coolican, who is the editor-in-chief of the Minnesota Reformer. Again, one more time, make sure you go to Minnesota Reformer for the best in Minnesota news and politics. Patrick, thanks again for coming on the show today.
Always a pleasure.
Well, normally when I wrap up my interviews with Patrick, I turn things back over to Matt McNeil, but today, of course, I'm filling in for Matt, so on the other side of the break, you'll get more of me coming up next here on AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota.